Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tutable Future. Today with me, I have the fantastic philosopher, writer, general, amazing arguer, and logic bro for the left, Ben Burgis. Ben, hello.
Hi, how are you doing here?
I'm fantastic, thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
That's great. So, Ben, here, obviously, you're a columnist for several different publications: Jacobin, Arc Digital, Current Affairs. The author of several books. The most recent of these being "Myth and Mayhem: The Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson," as well as the fantastic "Give Them an Argument" that I have right here. Also, amazing art there, Ben Shapiro, if everyone can see. There you go.
Yeah, I should mention that illustration of David Hume hushing Ben Shapiro as he says facts don't care about your feelings was created by my friend Ryan Lake, who does a philosophy-themed webcomic called Chaos Pet.
Okay, well, I'll make sure I put that in the link in the description if you want to check that out. So me and Ben here, we have a range of discussions today about both, the relevance of online leftism, as well as a lot of questions about philosophy, and then your ability to integrate that into arguments and into basically persuading people. And my first question is a very simple one. Ben, what do you believe?
What do I believe?
The most general question I could possibly ask.
Lots of stuff.
Oh.
Give
me the top five.
I don't know. The law of the excluded middle. The sky is blue. Let's see.
Watch the podcast get derailed into epistemology. Throw some random Descartes stuff at you. Anyway, what is your political project? To be far more
there we go. That's more specific. I'm a democratic socialist. If I if I lived where you do, I would have enthusiastically supported Jeremy Corbyn, and I would have been very disappointed by more recent events.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds same here, but not to inflict any biases too early. So first question as well is the book that I have here is obviously Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and what I'd like to know is, first of all, what is this book about? What's its purpose? But then also, what is the problem that you've ascribed that you were trying to solve with this book?
Yeah. So the purpose of the book is to do a couple things at the same time. One is that it's a polemic for leftists, people who share the sort of political commitments I just gestured at, which is a broad range of people who I might not necessarily agree with about everything, but let's say people with political positions to the left of liberalism, right? Mm-hmm. That they should care more than some of them sometimes do about getting the arguments right, about logic, avoiding logical fallacies, things like that. And part of what spurred it was kind of noticing that so for example, right, there's a very popular U.S. Left-wing podcast called Chapo Trap House, of which I'm a fan. I like it, but it's sort of a standing joke on the show for a long time, was about, debate being silly and logical fallacies sort of being a way that nerds can try to give people a yellow card in a debate. And I understand where that comes from, because oftentimes, a certain kind of deeply annoying, often libertarian, sort of right-wing persona is very invested in, well, at least the terminology, the rhetoric of logic and pointing out logical fallacies and things like this in a very superficial and very annoying way. And so it's natural, I think, that people, start to develop this reaction where they roll their eyes when they hear that terminology. But I think it's also dangerous for a couple of reasons, right? One of which, well, all right. So just really quickly, I think one reason that's a dangerous overreaction is that there are people who could go either way politically, who we could potentially persuade. but not necessarily. If we never get around to telling these people what's wrong with, what's wrong with the other arguments, the other side, right? Why exactly, this is right and not that. If all we do, in other words, like if our only mode of engagement, with people who disagree with us is either mockery or moral condemnation, then those potentially persuadable people, a lot of them are going to understandably conclude that we just don't have a good response to the arguments, or else we would have given it by now. So that's one worry, right? There's a lot of mythology about how debate is pointless, nobody's ever really convinced, which maybe we could say more about later. But I think it misses a lot of the point, right? That you're rarely doing a debate to try to convince the other person on the stage, right? You're trying to convince other people who might be watching, who aren't necessarily married to the positions, right? The way that the person you're debating most likely is. So that's one thing, right? I think that we lose persuadable people. It's also true that oftentimes the purpose of argument isn't even to debate anyone. It's just to figure out what you think is true, right? You're mentioning Descartes, right? I mean, that would be the sort of obvious example, right? That there's nobody that Descartes is arguing with who thinks that the external world doesn't exist, right? He's just trying to settle in his own mind how he can be sure that it does. And the same goes for a lot of things that are maybe more up in the air than the existence of the external world. And then the other reason, is that if our primary modes of engagement, or especially if our only modes of engagement with people we disagree with politically, are mockery and moral condemnation, then when disagreements arise on the left, right, between leftists who basically share the same goals, which is not hypothetical. I'm pretty sure that's actually happened at least once every 15 minutes since the French Revolution. Then if the only tools that we have are mockery and moral condemnation, that's what we're going to turn on each other. And that's kind of how you get left Twitter.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the book very much engages with what is often described as this sort of, the online culture war between, the left and the right. Specifically with, the Ben Shapiro types, the Dave Rubin types, or, the debate me bros across the political spectrum. Yeah. What role does trying to win this culture war play in actually trying to see left-wing values implemented? How can a online culture war translate into actual political change?
Yeah. So part of the answer, of course, is that it's only a very small part of it, right? That even to the extent that that we're clearly winning that sort of argument, that might be a necessary condition, it's certainly not a sufficient one, for any sort of political victories. Yeah. Well, if only, right? If only it were that easy, right? That all we had to do was have like a really good argument.
We just needed our Ben Shapiro, then we'd be there.
Yeah. Not that I think he is a font of really good arguments, but yeah, absolutely, right? So, and of course, that's obviously not the case, right? The primary obstacles to political change are institutional. They have to do with with competing both competing values and competing interests, right? You're not going to give Jeff Bezos a really, really good argument, and then that's going to lead him to giving up his billions and turning Amazon into a workers' cooperative or something. That obviously won't happen. And in fact, one of the themes of the book is that not all political disagreement arises, right, from bad reasoning or anything like that, right? Getting the facts wrong, right? That sometimes we just have really different worldviews. But that said, it is undeniably the case that that people do change their minds because of arguments. In fact, I'm often, kind of baffled when I see people, who I know something about on the left saying, oh, nobody ever changed their mind, because of arguments. And sometimes I'll look at the person who's saying it and be like, okay, I know you. You grew up in an evangelical household. You became an atheist when you were 17 because you started watching Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens videos online. You were like a normal MSNBC watching liberal up until late in the Obama administration. And then you became a socialist when Bernie Sanders, ran for president. And now you're like halfway to Maoism, and you're going to tell me that nobody ever changes their mind because of arguments. Something's, like there's some dissonance there. And I also think that oftentimes we tell ourselves that, oh, nothing that goes on online really matters. It's not important that people that, this is just kind of, real politics all happens elsewhere. And this is just kind of this, weird blood sport sort of entertainment thing that we do. And there's some truth to that, but I think that it's also, if you want to be a materialist in 2020, I think you have to acknowledge that an awful lot of politics actually does take place in that sphere, right? That people people really do form a lot of their views there, and those, there's no hard and fast line between online and offline. And in fact, I think this is particularly clear in the last few months because, although this finally started to change a bit, with the protests after the murder of George Floyd, for a long time there, nobody was willing to do anything like actually go out and do an in-person, political protest because we have a plague going, right? So like that's, you obviously can't do that. So all political organizing for a while, right, was online, which should certainly be a reminder that it's not, even when, thank God that starts to change a little, right? It's certainly not a sphere we could just dismiss as like irrelevant to real politics.
Mm-hmm. So, a few years ago, cast our minds back to 2016, the right dominated this online sphere of politics. Names like Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson were really the only online prominent voices in politics. How do you think this has changed up until now? There's way more online leftists who grow prominence. I would include yourself in that. People like Chapo Trap House and plenty of other of this sort of wing. How do you think that the online political sphere has changed in this time?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of that. I don't think it's just because we're all so clever and handsome and we all make such good arguments that that people.
But it's true. But it's true.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that, right? But beyond that, I think that some of it has to do with political shifts in the wider world. I mentioned Corbyn earlier. Certainly the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016 was a huge shot in the arm to the left, and certainly like Chapo, right? I mean, is an obvious example of it's a very funny and charming show. There's a reason it was so successful, right? But it's also the fact that four people. I guess three people originally, right? Who were like semi-prominent Twitter shit posters, who originally they were on an episode of another podcast called Street Fight to make fun of a movie that had just come out, and people thought that they had a good interaction and they should do a podcast of their own. That might well have happened in a world where the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign didn't happen, but I'm guessing that would have been a much more niche podcast, then, right? Like obviously there was there was an audience for it, right? That wouldn't have otherwise existed. So that's definitely part of the answer. And even though, of course, those larger those larger initial victories for the left in real world politics. That there's been a change of fortunes there, obviously, in certainly in terms of both the U.S. and British examples, but I also think, and some of that is obviously local and has to be contextualized in that, but I also think there's a larger overarching issue in the way that the rise of right-wing populism has made it difficult for people to the left of mainstream liberalism to convince otherwise convincible people that we're like the horse to bet on, to defeat the right. But even so, right, like there's still, the political landscape has still changed for the better overall. That's part of it. But I also think part of it is that is that there is there was a I think that there was a vacuum there that did have to be filled even on its own terms, that after, to pick the example of Jordan Peterson, right? Peterson has, spends a couple years, doing this incredibly successful shtick, that heavily involves, going around denouncing, what he sees as postmodern Marxists, and so I think that after you've heard this enough times, right? I think it's natural that people start to get curious about, okay, well, who are these guys? What might they have to say, right? I think there's something to that, and then finally, I just think that some maybe more constrained version of the flippant answer I gave at first, right? Might have some truth to it, right? That, in other words, that there are, as long as the dynamic is one where the sort of place where, especially that kind of very online version of the right thrives, is in an environment where the left or liberals, and usually they don't make much of a distinction there, right, is scolding them for being bad, and they get to be the sort of subversive response to that, right? That's somebody's giving a very I think the sort of political landscape in which they thrive is one that's kind of represented by the image of somebody giving a very dense academic lecture about why you should be guilty for being white, and they're sitting there, in a Leonard Skinner shirt, smoking a cigarette and being cool and subversive about it, and so I think part of what's going on is that there's, it's complicated and very incomplete, right? But there is increasingly a large chunk of the left that isn't falling for it, right? That in other words, that we get people like the Chapo hosts, who are just as funny and irreverent as anybody on the right, that we get people just to pick a couple of my favorite examples, like Nathan Robinson, who's the editor of Current Affairs, or Bhaskar Sankara, Jacobin, who aren't just sort of scolding people or worrying about legitimizing their opponents by giving them a platform or anything like that, right? They're making real arguments, and people can see that, right? So I think to the extent that we've got a so I think part of it's there's a very long answer to a very simple question, but but I think part of it's political shifts in the wider world. Part of it's that there was a vacuum that needed to be filled, and part of it's just that there's that increasingly we have at least some of the left engaging in a smarter, funnier, more interesting way, and that's more appealing to people than just sort of sitting in your corner scolding anybody who who tells an off-color joke or does a debate with a bad person because then because that legitimizes the bad person.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that often gets talked about in the sort of left versus right sphere is the difference in organization. Often people would say that the the right is a far more organized group. They have the intellectual dark web, whilst on the left, if you were to say the intellectual light web, is often caught eating itself. And the other day you yourself tweeted that there is a need for a more strategically effective left.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by this, and how can this be applied?
Yeah. So of course, there are cases of the right eating itself too, but I'm for that. So yeah, and of course, they have the advantage that they're defending the status quo, which if nothing else has inertia on its side, right? We don't have any of those. We don't have any of those advantages, and certainly, Nathan Robinson and Bhaskar Sunkar are not, are not constantly getting, loving profiles in the New York Times and, et cetera, right? So yeah, I think we do need a more strategically savvy left, and what I mean by that, right, can maybe be illustrated by a couple of instances, but I think before getting into detailed examples, I think just the more general phenomenon is that oftentimes before those kinds of political shifts in the wider world that we were talking about before started to happen, we kind of had decades where things were pretty bleak if you cared about any kind of larger left project. So, the labor movement certainly has been in retreat for several decades. Even good social democrats, like Sanders or Corbyn, right, have been very marginal, right, in up until extremely recently, right. I knew who Bernie Sanders was before 2016, but mostly because my grandmother thought that he might be like a third cousin or something, and so she brought him up, it's like, oh, the guy who won this congressional seat of Vermont, right? Yeah, there's certainly an affinity in the speaking style. I don't know if she was right about the genealogy, but
yeah, close enough.
But in any case, these were very obscure figures. Certainly, any sort of prospect of more basic radical change to the economic structure was widely felt to be completely off the table. In that this sort of end of history era in the 1990s, and so all right, if you take somebody I have tremendous respect for, like Noam Chomsky, if you read Chomsky, you never get the sense that question of what the left, very nice, good book, what the left would how the left would handle itself if it were actually to achieve political power and try to achieve any of its goals. You don't get the sense that this question is even really arising for him, right? And fair enough, because he was formed at a time when the prospects for that were very bleak. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that even as things have started to get better, I think there are a lot of bad habits that spill over from the previous era. And I'm not claiming this is a total explanation for all these problems, right? But I think it's a underappreciated aspect of it, right? So what I mean by that is that very often, I think during this kind of long exile from real world power, people with political positions, the left of liberalism, I think kind of got used to thinking of radical politics as a kind of performance of individual moral commitment, right? Because all you can really do, is take a stand, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're
virtue signaling.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, yes, it's an overused word, and I understand why people are used to hearing it from terrible people. They might have a bad reaction to it, but there's not, that doesn't mean there's nothing to it. Mm-hmm. Right. And so for example, right. Michael Albert, right, who's another leftist from that era, but who's somebody who I think maybe has more of a perspective on this stuff than some people do. You know, like he has this great rant you can find on YouTube where he's complaining about the phrase "fighting the good fight," right? You know, it's like, you know, it's, you know, like and why he hates it so much. It's like, you know, if, you know, like, oh well, you know, didn't never won me. Fought the good fight. You know, it's like, well, what's the point, right? Like, you know, if you're not gonna if there's no serious prospect of winning, then like, you know, there's so many more things that you could do with your life that would be so much more fun, you know, than fighting the good fight, right? Go to the beach, right? What do you like, you know, why would you spend your life doing this? Um, and when you see politics as just sort of taking a moral stand rather than trying to change the world, this can very naturally lead to a framework where you spend a lot of time worrying about whether other people who claim to be taking a stand are really, you know, are really displaying the right sort of moral commitment. And this leads to a lot of pathological behavior where people engage in, you know, sort of tear each other apart over bizarre nonsense. So I'll, you know, I said earlier I give concrete examples, so I'll just give one maybe really quickly, right? Which is that there's a very prominent left-wing YouTuber named Natalie Wynn. She's better known by the name of her YouTube channel, which is Contrapoints. And she's certainly a big part of that sort of resurgence of the left side of the online political wars you were talking about earlier. And she's actually incredibly effective at it, right? Like, so I remember, I don't know, a year ago, but I'm not sure exactly, like she had she posted something on Twitter where she invited people who'd changed their mind about something as a result of one of her videos to sort of volunteer. You know, there's their story about that, and there was a flood of it, right? You know, people who used to be everything from Republicans to, you know, feminists who were transphobic to Nazis, right? You know, there are people who were Nazis that she persuaded. So this. I mean, if anything's a public service, that would have to be it. You know, getting somebody to not be a Nazi anymore, and twice now within the last year or so, I've seen her be, to use a slightly inaccurate term, but it's the generally, you know, it's the term that's generally in use. So I'll just say canceled, right? You know, like I think I mean, there's a lot of like, I know you're opening a can of worms when you say that, because there are all these canned responses like, oh, come on, nobody's ever really canceled. Look at how many people still, you know, follow her or whatever, right? You know, which to my mind kind of misses the point, right? Like if you want to say, like I say canceled because that way everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Because and by the way, let's remember it was the cancelers who started calling it that, right? You know, like that wasn't some term that somebody else made up to attribute to them, right? But like, you know, I think maybe a more accurate term than cancel culture would be like shaming culture, public denunciation culture, or something like that. And it's toxic and unhelpful, even when, as is usually the case, it doesn't completely rob people of their careers, right? And so I've seen her be canceled the last year a couple of times, and in both cases, like, it wasn't because there was some, you know, video that surfaced of Natalie Wynn calling black people the N-word or something like that, right? You know, like there wasn't, you know, it was in one case, she, you know, and she's a trans woman, right? You know, she talks about that all the time, right? And she expressed some frustration with the sort of ritual and certain kinds of in-person left spaces of everybody going around, you know, saying their pronouns, and says, you know, it could be a room where she's clearly the only trans person there, and everybody's doing this, and when you know it comes to her turn, everybody's like staring at her, you know, like waiting for it. And it's like, yeah, this makes me kind of uncomfortable, and I find it kind of ironic that this is something that happens in what are supposed to be these very like trans-friendly left-wing spaces. But I can go to a sports bar in North Carolina and be missed and mammed all night with no problem, right? You know, like. Since for a lot of binary passage trans people like her, right, The whole point is to have one's gender assumed, right? That's what you want, right? That's whereas there are other people, especially non-binary trans people, who don't want their gender assumed and maybe appreciate this sort of ritual that she's talking about, which she granted in the Twitter thread, right? She wasn't saying nobody's ever allowed to do this again. She was expressing her personal frustrations, right? To using another wildly overused term, her lived experience, right? So, which, by the way, you can just say experience, lived adds nothing, but
it makes it feel so much stronger, though.
Yeah, it does.
When I see the lived, I suddenly believe them a lot more.
Right, exactly. Right. So like the first time she was like hounded off of Twitter, it was largely because of this. The second time, it was because in one of her videos, she'd given about 3 seconds of voice work to somebody named Buck Angel, who's he's a trans icon of a previous generation, and he has a view that's sometimes called trans medicalism, which is that you only genuinely trans if you experience diagnosable dysphoria and seek to medically transition, which is obviously very controversial, in the trans community. In fact, it's controversial enough that Natalie Wynn herself has said many times that she disagrees with it, right? But even though she said many times that she disagrees with it, there's also an issue about Buck Angel having, behaved badly during the middle of an ugly divorce decades ago, which, maybe he did, right? I don't think that, it's not like, I think you'd have to like really do some research and dig up some like ancient pieces of print media to track down who exactly said what about who, during this divorce decades ago. But I guess my instinct about that is that that's the business of the Angel family, and or I don't know if he was even using that last name at the time, but whatever, right? Like that's not particularly a matter of public interest to me. If he did bad things back then okay. Right. But I don't know that means that anybody who says anything nice about him or associates with him in any way decades later is therefore responsible for those bad things. And I certainly don't think having a bad position, right, that you have a wrong view about something, therefore not only are you canceled, but somebody who gives you 3 seconds of voice work and doesn't denounce you when invited to do so, right? They express disagreement with you, but they don't denounce you as a bad person, is therefore canceled. That strikes me as insanely self-defeating behavior, right? This is the sort of thing that makes a lot of good people want to run screaming in the opposite direction, right? Have just nothing to do with us, because who wants that, right? Why would you sign up for the idea that like, okay, join our movement, so anything that you do can be scrutinized for microscopic traces of problematicness and then dredged up, whenever anybody's angry at you. Like that's just kind of a toxic culture that not only doesn't help advance any of our goals in the real world, ranging from fighting against discrimination against, trans people through socialized healthcare, et cetera, right? Not only does that not help achieve any of those goals, I would argue that it actively undermines it because it makes us really unappealing to a lot of otherwise persuadable people.
Mm-hmm. So pivoting now onto the more philosophical side of your work. So as you can see here on the cover of the book, we have David Hume silencing Ben Shapiro. Yes. And in a lot of your work, there are very clear, I was going to say undertones, philosophical overtones, which are very prominent throughout the work. In particular, when being mixed with online leftism or very grounded topics. What do you see as the role of philosophy in actual, I guess, daily political issues, or in things which people would often disconnect themselves from?
Yeah. So a couple of things, right? So one, I think it's just very good training for taking apart bad arguments that are brought up in political contexts. So two of the people I praised earlier, Natalie Wynn and Nathan Robinson, were both at least undergraduate philosophy majors. Glenn Greenwald is the third one who's in that category. Wynn actually was in graduate school in philosophy, and I think she dropped out before she got her PhD, and started just making YouTube videos, and she makes a living off of that. So good on her, right? That's but that's one thing, right? That I think I think some of the skill set translates, but beyond that, though, right? Like let's take the David Hume example. So one of the big themes of the book that I referred to earlier is that people like Ben Shapiro, when he uses that catchphrase, right? Facts don't care about your feelings. Of course they don't. They also don't care about other facts or anything else, right? But what seems to be suggested by that is that fuzzy-headed, overly emotional leftists come to political conclusions on the basis of their feelings, whereas the really hard-headed, ultra masculine,
Ben Shapiro, ultra masculine.
Yes, that's right. It's the first word that would come to mind. Anybody who's seen him in all 3 feet of his glory. But in any case, suppose that was problematic. But in any case,
editing exists. I'm not going to edit it out.
Don't edit it out.
Continue.
But in any case, that they come to their conclusions on the basis of the empirical facts, and actually, when David Hume in the treatise on human nature is talking about facts and values, it's what might look like a fairly esoteric philosophical point that directly applies here. So Hume's point is that you can't infer ought conclusions, right? Value conclusions about what's good or bad, what's right or wrong, what we should or shouldn't do, from purely factual, non-moral factual premises, right? That, like, in other words, that you can't take a bunch of is conclusions, a bunch of is premises, and validly get an ought conclusion out of it. It just doesn't follow, right, all by itself, which might seem well, either it might seem sort of trivial and obvious, although I would argue that it's really not, right? At all, right? Because people do this all the time, right? Or think they do. And certainly this is actually a really historically important insight, right? It's one of the many ways that Hume is really influencing Kant, for example, who's trying to ground moral values in a version of pure rationality, but he still knows that yes, for people listening to this on audio, that's
the pure reason.
Yeah. So he's trying to do that, right? But he but having internalized as Hume, right? He knows that one thing you can't get it from is the empirical facts, right? So in the groundwork, the metaphysics of morals, Kant says has a nice example. Which is actually also relevant to another person I just mentioned earlier, the people who I think it should be a point of pride for academic philosophy that they were philosophy majors in college. One that I think it should be a point of deep shame for academic philosophy that he was a philosophy major in college is Sam Harris, who wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, where he's entirely devoted it to saying that you can infer of conclusions about values straight from the empirical facts, and doesn't engage with anything that's been written about this for the last 300 years in between. But one of Harris's examples, part of how he supports this is like, okay, I guess you can have these arguments about what's morally good and bad. But hey, we could have arguments about what counts as healthy or unhealthy, but nobody denies that medicine is a science. to which I say you should read The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, right? Because one of Kant's examples about that exact point is that exactly the same medical knowledge that is going to be helpful to a doctor in curing somebody is going to be helpful to a poisoner in killing them, right? In other words, like the knowledge itself doesn't tell you anything about how to use it, right? So once we decide what counts as healthy, then we can have, medical science, can tell us how to make somebody healthy. The same as once we decide what our moral or political goals are, empirical facts might be relevant, helping us figure out how to achieve those goals. We can look at what's worked in the past, for example, but they can't tell us which goals we should care about in the first place. And in fact, all sorts of controversies in health should help illustrate this, right? That distinction that Harris is sliding past between medical science and what we could maybe call the philosophy of health, right? That figure out what we think counts as healthy. So, so the DSM used to include homosexuality, as a disorder. Now it doesn't. That's not primarily because we discovered some new empirical facts about what causes sexual orientation, a subject about which, there's still considerable uncertainty, right? It's primarily because we decided that, what we could call the portion of our conception of what a good life is that we call health, right? Doesn't include, having one sexual orientation rather than another, right? That in other words, there was a moral and political argument there. And you can find lots of examples about this, right? Lots of intellectual dark web types were freaking out about a year ago because the American Psychological Association had put something out about toxic masculinity, and they didn't like that, right? And again, there's no science that can tell you whether or not, toxic masculinity is an undesirable thing that psychiatrists should talk about, right? That's an argument about values. Mm-hmm. And so, ultimately all political commitments, right, are going to be rooted in feelings. In other words, in goals. Even if you want to be a rock hard materialist about this and say those goals are entirely, rooted in interest, right? Still, whatever, right? In caring about achieving certain goals, which is something that the facts aren't going to be able to tell us, right? You could argue against somebody who has a certain goal, who values something you don't think that they should. You could argue against that by showing them they're being inconsistent about it. You could argue about that by appealing to some deeper value they might care about more, right? That's going to lead them to reject, the other one, right? All of that's fair enough. I try to do stuff like that all the time, but ultimately the idea that there's any response to caring about some goal other than here's something else you care about, right? That the facts by themselves could tell you is just wrong. So one more quick example. When Ben Shapiro was rather infamously at this point being interviewed by Andrew Neil, the BBC, and as anybody who's seen that knows, he did a fine job and handled himself very calmly, really showed how very, very mature, really showed how uninterested he is in feelings. Which is amazing because really that sort of high Tory vibe is what somebody like Shapiro is doing, an imitation of an imitation of an imitation of. But in any case, in that interview, Neil asks him about some extremely repressive laws about abortion that were that were passed in Georgia, the state I now live in, at that time, and that have extremely harsh punishments for abortion at different times of pregnancy, and it says, well, defend this, right? Why is this okay? Because even though he's a conservative, right? They on the BBC, they still have this sort of old-fashioned idea that interviewers should ask people hard questions, and in his response, Shapiro says, "Oh, well, the reason I believe this, I believe this is science, right? Because a fetus is a human life from the moment of conception, and of course, nobody denies that. Sometimes I think people, on various sides of the issue are sloppy about how they put it because." That's real world politics for you, right? Nobody consults with philosophers to get them to be precise about their conceptual categories before they start expressing their opinions. But I think on reflection, right? Nobody denies that a fetus is alive, right? That's not an interesting question. And nobody denies that. And certainly nobody denies that it's genetically human, right? That it's a human life. Nobody thinks a fetus starts out with raccoon DNA and only shifts to human, at a certain point of the pregnancy. That's not what the argument is about, right? The argument is about two things. One is when a fetus, becomes a person, right? Which you could absolutely concede a human and be alive, the same way. But think that the same way that we don't count acorns as oak trees, from the moment, they're in the ground, think that there's a certain point, probably a vague point, right, at which that line is crossed. And secondly, even if you do grant the controversial thing, right, that a fetus at such and such point in pregnancy counts as a person, then there's this question of how you weigh the right of a person to life against the right of the mother to bodily autonomy. And if you're actually interested in pursuing that question, you could read Judith Jarvis Thompson's classic paper, Defense of Abortion, where she gives her iconic sick violinist, thought experiment. And, whatever. There's you could have, you could be, a smart person, who's read all of this, and makes different, value judgments than I do and comes to a different conclusion. But thinking that science has anything to do with this is just asinine. And so I know this has been a very extended, example, but I think it does go to the larger point, which is that there are actually lots of philosophical distinctions like this that you don't need to have a master's degree in philosophy to be able to get the point. And they are actually incredibly relevant to ongoing political arguments. So I think, which is why I think it's a shame that so few people with the training in parsing philosophical arguments are sort of, sullying themselves by going out there and into the muck and making these points.
Mm-hmm. So my last question before we have to unfortunately wrap this up is, so you yourself, you were a professor of philosophy. You describe yourself as a philosophy instructor for the Michael Brooks Show. And how does one go about translating complex philosophical thought that people spend their entire lives just to try and, conceptualize or even understand? Kant's the perfect example of that. Yeah. To anyone really, in a way that is both digestible and practical in terms of, in what we focus on generally, of politics or values.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, in my day job as a lecturer in philosophy at Georgia State University Perimeter College, the good news, look, of course you're obviously right that nobody's that I'm not going to go on the Michael Brooks Show and try to unpack the critique of the pure reason, right? That would be, that would be, an interesting episode, but the segment might go long, So I'm not going to make any attempt to do that, right? There are plenty of philosophical arguments that either because they're just not relevant or because it's just the nature of the beast, right? That you're not going to be able to like there's not that much you can say about them in a few minutes on a podcast or, in a debate. So fair enough, right? I mean, like I do want more philosophers to sort of, sully themselves by going into the muck and, and applying, using their professional training to be helpful in these kinds of debates. But that doesn't mean that I don't think, specialized academic papers should exist, right? I've written some of those too. In fact, before the debate that I did with Stefan Molyneux, Stefan sort of tried to score a few points by digging up the abstract of a paper that I'd written and sort of screenshotting it on Twitter to make the point, oh, look at this indecipherable nonsense, right? Which I did tell him that I think that if, once he got a couple of basic concepts down, I could probably get him up to speed on everything in the paper in an hour or two on Zoom, and I was willing to do that service for him. But look, I mean, lots of things are in that category, but the good news is that lots of them aren't, right? So certainly the Hume, Ben Shapiro, Judith Jarvis Thompson examples just gave are firmly in the category of the ones that aren't. And also the good news is that, even in my day job, like I mostly, I've taught upper level and more esoteric things, different jobs that I've had. But, I mean, I spend, like most people, who do this for a living, I spend 99% of my time, teaching introductory classes because that's the nature of the beast. And, that's what they, that's the primary thing, right? That philosophers are employed to do. But the good news is that that doesn't mean that what you're doing all your time is irrelevant to your academic interests. So a friend of mine who was a professor at the institution where I went to grad school, he was kind of hired as I was finishing up, but by somebody I've gotten to know, told me once that as an undergraduate, he was a double major in philosophy and math. I guess I should, for local custom, I should make that plural, and he was at one point, he was considering doing graduate work in mathematics, and the reason that he didn't, right? Why he opted to do philosophy instead was, okay, look, being realistic about this, the overwhelming majority of people who, get PhDs in either of these things, right, are going to be hired at jobs where, for the most part, they teach, introductory classes, right? Whether that be, introduction to philosophy or whatever, college algebra or something, right? And the gap between what is taught in a college algebra class and what you spend your time thinking about as a mathematician is like this. For people listening to this on audio, I just held my hands far apart, right? Whereas the gap between what you spend your time thinking about as a philosopher and the questions that are being explored in intro to philosophy classes like this. I just held them really close together. There's no, there isn't really a big gap there, because even though the sort of specific moves that you might be making in an academic paper or a dissertation or something like that are obviously much more complicated than what you're going to be laying out, in a lecture in an introductory class, there are no interesting unsolved problems in college algebra. Introduction to philosophy has nothing but interesting unsolved problems.
Well, that's fantastic, Ben. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been great. I have a long list of things to plug for you, so get ready for this. You didn't ask me for this, by the way. This is all me. 1, at Ben Burgis on Twitter. 2, the Dead Pundits podcast, co-host of. Buy the book, and then buy the other book. Both of the links will be in the description if you'd like to check those out. Ben, thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thank you.
This has been amazing. Thank you very much.